There are moments in life that don't arrive with noise. They don't announce themselves or ask for your attention. They simply settle into the background so quietly that you mistake them for ordinary days. Then, without realizing when it happened, you discover that the ordinary has been rewritten. I've spent years believing that change was always visible. I thought transformation came through difficult conversations, painful endings, impossible decisions, or unforgettable memories. I believed you could always point to a single moment and say, that was where everything became different. Now I know better. Some changes don't begin with an event. They begin with a presence, not the kind of presence that demands attention, the kind that quietly rearranges the space around your thoughts until nothing sits where it once did. I didn't notice it at first. Why would I? Life was moving the way it always had. My routine stayed the same. My habits remained untouched. I still woke up with the same responsibilities, spoke to the same people, and carried the same version of myself through every ordinary day. From the outside, nothing had changed. But the outside has never been where the real story lives. The real story begins underneath, somewhere beneath language, somewhere beneath emotion, somewhere beneath the explanations we create simply because silence makes us uncomfortable. That's where I found myself changing. Not all at once, not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough that I couldn't return to the person I believed I had been. People often think understanding begins with answers. I've started believing it begins with better questions. Not questions about who someone is, not questions about where they're going, questions about why certain people feel strangely familiar before they've earned the right to, questions about why some conversations seem unfinished even after hours of speaking, while others remain complete despite only a handful of words, questions about why a single person's existence can quietly become part of your internal landscape without ever asking for permission. These aren't romantic questions. They're deeper than that. Romance depends on expectation. This exists independently of expectation. It survives without promises, without certainty, without definitions. That is exactly what makes it difficult to explain. I've tried reducing it to coincidence. That explanation never lasted. I've tried calling it curiosity. Curiosity eventually fades. This didn't. I've tried convincing myself that familiarity was simply an illusion created by repeated interaction. But repetition alone doesn't create recognition. I've repeated conversations with hundreds of people throughout my life. Most disappeared from memory before the week had ended. A few remained because circumstances demanded it. Very few remained because something about their existence quietly attached itself to the way I understood the world. Those people become landmarks. Not because they're louder than everyone else, because they become reference points. Everything begins making sense in relation to them. I never intended for anyone to become one of mine. I've always preferred standing slightly outside of things, watching, listening, observing before participating. Distance creates perspective, perspective creates accuracy, accuracy creates safety. At least, that's what I believed. When you remain just far enough away, nothing reaches you deeply enough to leave permanent marks. You become difficult to misunderstand because very little is ever exposed. Most people meet a carefully measured version of you, not fake, simply filtered. A translation, the original always remains somewhere else, untouched, protected. For years, I believed that was wisdom. Maybe it was, or maybe it was simply another form of fear wearing the clothes of discipline. It's strange how long we can mistake our defenses for our personality. Eventually, they become impossible to separate. You begin introducing yourself through the walls you've built. You stop remembering what existed before them. I didn't realize that it happened to me until something unexpected occurred. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would have noticed. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a life-changing conversation, it wasn't even a moment important enough to describe as significant. It was smaller than that. A pause. A silence that somehow felt more complete than most conversations I'd ever experienced. Most silence feels empty. People rush to escape it. They search for another sentence before the previous one has finished settling. Words become distractions from the discomfort of simply existing together without performance. I've always understood that. I've watched people fill quiet moments with meaningless observations because they believed absence of speech meant absence of connection. I've never agreed. Some silences reveal more than explanations ever could. Some pauses carry enough truth to replace entire conversations. That was the first thing I noticed. Not what was said, what wasn't. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel responsible for carrying the conversation forward. I didn't feel pressured to translate my thoughts into something easier to understand. I didn't feel the familiar need to simplify complicated ideas so they would fit inside ordinary language. Instead, AB simply allowed the moment to exist. That sounds insignificant. It wasn't. Because people don't realize how exhausting constant translation becomes. Imagine living your entire life converting everything you genuinely think into smaller pieces because you assume no one wants the complete version. Imagine editing every sentence before it leaves your mouth. Imagine predicting misunderstandings before they happen, and quietly adjusting yourself to prevent them. Eventually, you stop noticing you're doing it. It becomes automatic. You no longer speak naturally. You speak strategically, not to manipulate, to survive. When that habit disappears, even briefly, you notice the difference immediately. It's almost unsettling. Not because freedom feels unfamiliar, because you forgot how heavy the restraint had become. That's what happened. Nothing more, nothing less, and yet somehow everything after that felt slightly different, not transformed, recalibrated, like an instrument being tuned so gradually that the musician only notices after the music begins sounding clearer. Clarity is an unusual thing. People assume they want it until it arrives. Then they discover clarity removes excuses. Confusion allows postponement. Uncertainty allows avoidance. Clarity quietly asks for honesty. Honesty asks for courage. I wasn't sure I possessed that courage, not because the truth frightened me, because the consequences of acknowledging it felt irreversible. There are some realizations you can't unknow once they've become visible. They're like doors that disappear behind you the moment you walk through them. No dramatic sound, no final announcement. Just the quiet understanding that the landscape has permanently changed. I began noticing myself in unfamiliar ways, not becoming someone different, becoming more visible to myself. Those are separate experiences. Changing suggests replacement, divides, suggests discovery. Perhaps we've always been ourselves. Perhaps life simply determines how much of that self becomes illuminated. If that's true, then certain people don't change us. They reveal rooms inside us we've never entered. Rooms that existed long before anyone arrived, locked, dust-covered, waiting patiently beneath years of routine. The strange part is that those rooms don't always contain answers. Sometimes they contain better questions, questions you've unknowingly avoided your entire life, questions that don't accuse, questions that simply remain present until you're finally willing to face them. I've met intelligent people. I've met kind people. I've met people who understood my words. Very few ever seemed interested in understanding the silence surrounding those words. There's always context beneath expression. Always another layer beneath the obvious one. Most conversations end where language stops. The meaningful ones begin there. That's what I've been trying to understand. Not another person, not even myself. The space that appears between two minds when neither one feels obligated to pretend. That space is rare. Not because honesty is rare, because sustained attention is. People often listen just long enough to prepare their own response. Few remain present long enough for another person's thoughts to finish unfolding naturally. Presence cannot be imitated. It either exists or it doesn't. And once you've experienced genuine presence, every performance becomes easier to recognize. Not disappointing, simply transparent. Perhaps that's why certain encounters refuse to fade, not because they overwhelm us, because they quietly become part of the way we interpret everything that follows. I don't know where this path leads. For the first time, I'm no longer trying to predict the destination. I'm paying attention to the direction instead. Maybe that's enough. Maybe certainty has never been the point. Maybe understanding isn't something we reach. Maybe it's something we continue becoming, one quiet realization at a time, until the person looking back from our own reflection feels less like a stranger than they did yesterday. Instead, here's an original continuation that maintains a deep, reflective, psychological tone while taking the narrative in its own direction. The strange thing about perception is that it never asks for permission before it changes. One day, you find yourself looking at the same world you've always known, yet nothing occupies the same place inside your mind. The streets haven't moved. The people haven't become different. Time continues with the same steady rhythm it has always kept. Yet something beneath your awareness has shifted its foundation. The change is almost impossible to explain because it isn't visible from the outside. It lives entirely in the way meaning begins to arrange itself. I used to believe meaning belonged to events. Now, I think it belongs to attention. Whatever we consistently pay attention to slowly reshapes the architecture of our inner world. Not dramatically, beatedly, quietly, almost respectfully. That's why the most significant transformations rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive carrying answers. They arrive carrying questions you never expected to ask. Lately, I've found myself questioning things I once accepted without hesitation. Not because I've become uncertain, because certainty itself has started to feel incomplete. There was a time when I trusted logic above everything else. If something could be explained, measured, categorized, I felt safe around it. If it couldn't, I assumed I simply hadn't gathered enough information yet. Eventually, every mystery would surrender to careful observation. That belief carried me through most of my life, until I encountered experiences that refused to become smaller just because I understood them intellectually. Some truths don't become lighter when they're explained. They become heavier, not with burden, with significance. There's a difference. Burdens ask you to escape them. Significance asks you to carry them carefully. I've started realizing that the most meaningful parts of life aren't necessarily the loudest ones. They're often the quiet shifts no one applauds, the conversations that never become stories, the silences no one remembers except the people who lived inside them, the ordinary afternoons that somehow leave permanent fingerprints across years of memory. It's remarkable how often we underestimate quiet moments simply because they don't resemble the dramatic scenes we've been taught to value. Life isn't transformed only by extraordinary experiences. Sometimes it's transformed because one ordinary moment refuses to disappear. I've wondered why memory works that way, why certain days vanish completely while others remain untouched by time. Perhaps memory isn't recording importance. Perhaps it's recording authenticity, the moments where we existed without pretending. Those are the ones that remain, not because they were perfect, because they were real. Reality has a weight that performance never achieves. Performance can impress, reality simply stays. That's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. I've spent so much of my life trying to understand what makes people feel connected, shared interests, shared experiences, shared values. Those things matter, but they don't explain everything. I've seen people with identical backgrounds misunderstand one another completely. I've watched strangers recognize something familiar in each other within minutes. There's another layer beneath biography, a quieter one. It has nothing to do with where you've been. It has everything to do with how you move through what you've been given. Some people experience the same event and emerge carrying entirely different worlds inside them. Not because one was stronger, because each person translated the experience differently. Translation shapes identity far more than circumstance ever could. Maybe that's why certain conversations feel instantly recognizable. You're not recognizing someone's story. You're recognizing the structure beneath it, the way they organize meaning, the way they approach uncertainty, the way they remain present with complexity instead of rushing towards simple conclusions. I've become increasingly cautious around easy answers, not because they're always wrong, because reality rarely fits inside them. Life seems to prefer paradox, strength and vulnerability existing together, confidence and doubt sharing the same voice, hope surviving alongside disappointment. The older I become, the less interested I am in choosing one side over the other. Perhaps maturity isn't certainty. Perhaps it's developing enough capacity to hold contradictions without demanding immediate resolution. That realization has changed how I see people. I no longer expect consistency in every emotion. I expect honesty. They're different things. Consistency creates predictability. Honesty creates trust. Trust has little to do with perfection. It has everything to do with whether someone allows reality to exist without constantly editing it. I've begun asking myself difficult questions, not because I enjoy discomfort, because unanswered questions quietly influence every decision we make. Ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. It only gives them permission to operate unnoticed. There was a version of me that believed self-awareness had an ending, as though one day I would finally understand myself completely. Now that idea feels almost impossible. Understanding isn't a destination, it's a relationship, one that changes every time life introduces another perspective. Every conversation, every loss, every unexpected encounter, every quiet realization. Each one rearranges the map slightly. Not enough to become someone else, enough to become someone more complete. Completion, however, isn't the same as perfection. I've stopped chasing perfection. Perfection leaves no room for growth, no room for surprise, no room for grace. I'd rather become someone capable of remaining open. Open to being corrected, open to discovering that yesterday's certainty was only part of today's understanding. There's humility in that. Not the humility that pretends to know nothing. The humility that knows knowledge is always unfinished. I've noticed something else. The more honestly I observe my own mind, the less interested I become in controlling every outcome. Control promises security. Presence offers something deeper, participation. Maybe life was never asking me to master every uncertainty. Maybe it was asking me to remain awake inside it, to witness without rushing, to respond instead of react, to notice before deciding. These sound like small differences. They're not. Entire lives unfold according to distinctions this quiet. Most people think transformation requires dramatic decisions. Sometimes it requires a different quality of attention. Attention determines perception. Perception determines meaning. Meaning quietly determines identity. The process is almost invisible while it's happening. Only afterward do you realize you've become someone capable of seeing what once remained hidden. I've become grateful for that hiddenness. Not everything should reveal itself immediately. Some truths require patience because patience prepares the person who will eventually receive them. If understanding arrived before we were capable of carrying it, it would become another fact instead of genuine wisdom. Wisdom isn't measured by information. It's measured by integration, by whether what you've learned has changed the way you exist. That's the question I keep returning to, not what have I discovered, but what has discovery asked me to become. Every meaningful realization eventually asks something in return, not payment, participation. It asks whether we're willing to let understanding reshape our lives instead of remaining a beautiful idea. Ideas are comfortable. Embodied truth rarely is. It demands consistency. It asks us to live differently. That may be the quiet challenge waiting beneath every moment of genuine clarity, not whether we can recognize it, whether we can remain faithful to it after recognition fades into ordinary life, because ordinary life is where every important decision is ultimately made, not during dramatic moments, not during emotional highs, but during quiet mornings, routine conversations, small choices no one else notices. Character isn't built in extraordinary circumstances alone. It's revealed by what we repeatedly choose when nothing remarkable seems to be happening. Perhaps that's why the smallest moments deserve more respect than we usually give them. They become the invisible threads from which entire lives are woven. And maybe, years from now, when memory begins gathering the pieces of this season together, it won't remember every conversation or every thought. Maybe it will remember something much quieter. The feeling of becoming more honest with myself than I had ever been before. The moment I stopped asking whether life was giving me certainty and started asking whether it was inviting me into a deeper way of seeing. There comes a moment when reflection is no longer enough. You can spend years examining your own thoughts, tracing every emotion back to its origin, understanding every habit, every hesitation, every carefully constructed defense. You can become remarkably skilled at explaining yourself, but explanation has limits. At some point, life quietly asks a different question. Not whether you understand yourself, whether you're willing to become someone your understanding requires. For a long time, I believed awareness was the destination. If I could identify every pattern, recognize every instinct before it acted, observe every reaction without being consumed by it, then I imagined I had reached some final version of clarity. I don't believe that anymore. Awareness isn't an ending, it's an invitation. An invitation to participate more honestly in your own life. And honesty is rarely comfortable. Not because truth is cruel, because truth has a way of removing every place we once hid from ourselves. There were parts of me I described as discipline. Looking back, some of them were simply fear that had become respectable. There were habits I praised as independence. Some were nothing more than distance repeated often enough to become familiar. There were decisions I defended as wisdom. Some were avoidance wearing a convincing disguise. It's remarkable how easily the mind protects itself. Not through lies, through incomplete stories. It gives us explanations that are just accurate enough to prevent us from searching any deeper. The dangerous thing about partial truth is that it feels complete. You stop asking questions, you stop listening for what remains unsaid. You stop noticing the quiet places where another answer has been waiting all along. I've learned that growth rarely begins when someone gives you new information. It begins when an old certainty quietly loses its grip, not all at once, not dramatically, just enough that you can no longer carry it with the same confidence you once did. That feeling used to frighten me. Now I recognize it differently. It's the sound of an internal structure making room for something larger. Expansion almost never feels comfortable while it's happening. A seed doesn't experience growth as celebration. It experiences pressure. A horizon only becomes wider because you're willing to leave familiar ground behind. Maybe that's why meaningful change often feels so quiet from the outside and so overwhelming within. Nothing appears different, yet everything is slowly reorganizing itself. I've started paying attention to the questions I avoid. They reveal more about me than the answers I give. The questions I answer immediately usually live on the surface. The ones that make me pause, those are the ones connected to something real. I've noticed that every meaningful relationship, whether it lasts a lifetime or only a season, leaves behind more than memories. It leaves behind new ways of seeing. Sometimes another person's greatest influence isn't what they tell you. It's the perspective you discover after knowing them, long after conversations end, long after circumstances change. Something remains, not their voice, not their opinions, a different way of looking at ordinary things. Once perception changes, reality feels different without reality itself changing at all. That fascinates me. How can the same world become almost unrecognizable simply because the person observing it has become more honest? Perhaps reality has always been richer than my attention allowed. Perhaps nothing became deeper. Perhaps I finally slowed down enough to notice the depth that had always existed. We're taught to chase extraordinary moments. The older I become, the more I respect ordinary ones. An ordinary afternoon can contain enough truth to redirect an entire future. A quiet conversation can alter years of misunderstanding. A single realization can continue unfolding long after the moment that gave birth to it has disappeared. That's how life seems to move, not through constant revolutions. Through subtle adjustments that slowly become permanent. I've stopped measuring progress by intensity. Intensity fades, integration remains. What matters isn't how strongly something affects you in the moment. What matters is whether it quietly becomes part of the way you live afterward. I've had emotional experiences that disappeared within days. I've had quiet realizations that continued shaping my decisions years later. The quieter transformation often proves to be the deeper one. It doesn't compete for attention, it simply continues existing steadily, perceptibly, until one day you realize you've been living differently without ever announcing the decision to yourself. That's the mystery of genuine change. It doesn't always feel like choosing. Sometimes it feels like recognizing something that was waiting beneath years of noise. Recognition is a strange kind of relief, not because it gives you certainty, because it removes the exhausting effort of pretending not to know. There are truths we spend years negotiating with, not because they are unclear, because accepting them requires becoming someone new. That becoming takes courage, not dramatic courage, quiet courage, the courage to remain present when certainty disappears, the courage to continue listening after your favorite explanation stops making sense, the courage to admit that understanding isn't something you possess once and forever. It's something you practice every day, with every conversation, every disappointment, every unexpected joy, every ordinary morning that asks you to begin again. I've come to believe that identity isn't a finished sculpture. It's more like a living landscape, always changing with the seasons, always carrying traces of what came before while making room for what hasn't arrived yet. Nothing meaningful is truly static. Even mountains change, slowly enough that generations mistake them for permanence. Perhaps people are the same. Our deepest transformations happen so gradually that only time notices them. Then one day, someone says, "You've changed." And all you can think is, "No, AB finally stopped resisting who I was becoming." That difference matters. Because becoming isn't abandoning yourself. It's uncovering the parts that couldn't survive while hidden beneath fear, expectation, and habit. I've spent so much energy trying to protect my inner world. Maybe protection was necessary for a while, but eventually every shelter asks the same question. Are you still being protected? Or have you simply become afraid to leave? There's wisdom in building walls. There's also wisdom in recognizing when those walls have finished serving their purpose. Not every barrier deserves to become permanent architecture. Some are meant to be temporary bridges between one version of yourself and another. The challenge is knowing the difference. That answer never arrives through force. Only attention, careful attention, pot attention. The kind that doesn't rush toward conclusions simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. I've begun trusting that kind of attention more than certainty itself, because certainty sometimes closes doors too early. Attention keeps them open just long enough for truth to enter. Maybe that's all any of us are really learning, not how to become fearless, not how to become perfect, but how to remain available to whatever honest life is quietly asking of us next. And perhaps that quiet willingness, more than confidence, more than certainty, more than control, is what slowly transforms an ordinary existence into a deeply lived one. For so long, I believed every meaningful experience had to arrive with certainty before it deserved my trust. I waited for absolute clarity, for undeniable proof, for a moment that would remove every doubt before asking me to move forward. That moment never came. Instead, something quieter did, a calm recognition that not everything meaningful announces itself with certainty. Some things reveal themselves through consistency, through the way they remain present after the excitement fades, through the way they continue shaping your thoughts without demanding your attention. I've stopped asking whether every path guarantees the outcome I hope for. Now I ask something different. Does this path allow me to become more honest, more present, more myself? because if the answer is yes, then perhaps that's enough reason to keep walking. I've learned that life isn't changed only by the decisions everyone can see. It's changed by the silent ones, the moments when no one is watching, yet something inside you quietly chooses openness instead of fear, understanding instead of assumption, presence instead of distance. Those choices rarely receive recognition, but they become the foundation beneath everything else. Looking back, I realize I wasn't searching for another person to complete me. I was searching for the courage to meet myself without hiding. And somewhere along the way, through reflection, patience, and quiet awareness, I found that courage waiting where I least expected it, not as certainty, not as perfection, but as acceptance. An acceptance that growth doesn't erase who we've been, it gathers every version of us, every mistake, every lesson, every unanswered question, and shapes them into something more complete than certainty could ever create. Perhaps that's what maturity really is. Not having every answer, but no longer being afraid of the questions. So, wherever this journey continues from here, I know one thing with complete honesty. I won't return to the person I was before these realizations. Not because that person was wrong, but because they could only see as far as they had learned to look. Now the horizon is wider. The silence feels different. The ordinary carries more meaning. And the future no longer feels like something waiting to happen. It feels like something I'm finally ready to meet. Maybe that's all real transformation has ever been. Not becoming someone else, simply becoming fully present within the person you were always capable of being. And for the first time in a long time, that feels enough.